June 6th, 1944, 14:47 hours, Angerville-au-Plain, Normandy, France. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber lay in the mud with his left leg shredded below the knee, waiting for the Americans to finish him off. Blood pulsed through the improvised tourniquet he'd fashioned from his own belt 20 minutes earlier, each beat of his heart sending fresh agony up through his shattered femur and into his spine like electricity. The morphine syringe he'd jabbed into his thigh had done nothing except make the edges of his vision soft, and the screaming around him sound like it was coming from underwater. He was 23 years old, had fought in Poland and France and Russia, and he knew exactly what happened to wounded enemy soldiers when the battle was still hot and ammunition was scarce. You didn't waste bullets. You used a rifle butt or a bayonet, or you just kept walking. Klaus had done it himself outside Stalingrad to a Soviet corporal who'd been crying for his mother with both hands pressed against the hole in his stomach. He hadn't thought about it twice at the time, because that's what war was, and now it was his turn to receive the same mercy. The sounds of the battle had shifted. American voices now, close enough that Klaus could hear individual words, even though he didn't speak English. Bootsteps crunching through broken glass and splintered wood. The metallic click of rifles being reloaded. Someone shouting orders in that harsh, nasal accent that Klaus had learned to recognize during the last 6 hours of fighting. His platoon had held the stone farmhouse on the eastern edge of Angerville for most of the morning, firing down on the American paratroopers who dropped into the fields at dawn like locusts falling from the sky. 42 men of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment against what looked like half the American army, and they'd killed plenty of them before the 105mm howitzer shell had come through the second-floor window and turned the farmhouse into an abattoir. Klaus didn't remember the explosion itself, only waking up 15 meters away in a drainage ditch with his leg bent at an angle that legs weren't supposed to bend, and Unteroffizier Hartmann's corpse draped across his chest like a blanket, missing everything above the ribcage. He'd crawled maybe 30 meters before the pain made him black out again. When he came to the second time, the sun had moved and the shooting had gotten closer, and he realized with perfect clarity that he wasn't going to make it back to German lines. His leg was gone, functionally speaking, even if the tourniquet was keeping him from bleeding out immediately. He had maybe an hour before shock finished what the shrapnel had started. The Americans would find him long before that, and then it would be over. Klaus had been told, since his first day in the Wehrmacht, what Americans did to German prisoners. He'd seen the propaganda posters, heard the stories from veterans who'd fought in North Africa. Savage, undisciplined troops who tortured captives for sport, who shot wounded men rather than waste medical supplies on enemies. Animals in uniform, barely better than the Soviets. His company commander had been explicit during the briefing before D-Day. If the Allies invaded, you fought to the death because capture meant rape for the French women who collaborated and execution for any German soldier too injured to work. The bootsteps were getting closer now. Klaus forced his eyes open, squinting against the afternoon sun that had finally broken through the morning clouds. 3 American soldiers picking their way through the rubble of what used to be the village square, rifles raised, checking bodies. One of them saw Klaus move and said something sharp. All 3 weapons swung toward him. Klaus raised his hand slowly, the movement sending fresh waves of nausea through his gut. His right hand was empty, but his left was still clutching the Walther P38 pistol he'd drawn before blacking out. He let it fall into the mud. "Nicht schießen," he said, the words coming out slurred from the morphine and blood loss. "Don't shoot." He didn't know if they understood German. He didn't know if it mattered. The lead American was young, maybe 19, with corporal stripes on his helmet, and a face so pale it looked like he might vomit. The other two were older, harder, their eyes flat in the way that Klaus recognized from the Russian front. Men who'd killed enough that it didn't register anymore. One of them said something, and the corporal shook his head, pointing his rifle directly at Klaus's chest. This was it. Klaus closed his eyes. He thought about his mother in Hamburg, about his sister, Greta, who'd be 16 now, if she'd survived the bombing raids. He thought about the Soviet corporal outside Stalingrad and wondered if this was God's sense of justice, if there even was a God, if any of this meant anything at all beyond blood and mud and the senseless waste of young men killing each other over land that neither of them owned. The rifle shot didn't come. Instead, Klaus heard a new voice, sharp and commanding, shouting something that made the corporal lower his weapon. Klaus opened his eyes. A fourth American had appeared, this one wearing a helmet marked with a large red cross painted on white canvas. No rifle, just a canvas bag slung over his shoulder and blood all over his uniform from the elbows down. He was looking at Klaus's leg with the kind of clinical assessment that Klaus associated with field surgeons, not frontline infantry. The medic said something to the corporal, who argued back, gesturing at Klaus and then at the buildings where German snipers might still be hiding. The medic ignored him and knelt down next to Klaus, already pulling a tourniquet from his bag. Klaus jerked away instinctively, or tried to. His body wasn't cooperating. "Nein," he managed. "Nicht." The medic said something in English, his tone calm, almost gentle. He pointed at Klaus's leg and then at his own Red Cross armband and said what sounded like "help you" in badly accented German. Then, without waiting for permission, he grabbed Klaus's leg and began working on the tourniquet, his movements quick and practiced. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Klaus tried to scream, but only managed a choked gasp. The medic kept working, tightening the tourniquet above Klaus's knee with methodical efficiency. He pulled out a syringe of morphine and jammed it into Klaus's thigh without ceremony, then sprinkled white powder over the mangled flesh below the tourniquet. Sulfur powder, Klaus recognized dimly through the haze. The Americans had sulfur powder for a German prisoner. "Warum?" Klaus whispered. "Why?" The medic didn't answer, or maybe he didn't understand. He was already tying a tag to Klaus's uniform with handwriting that Klaus couldn't read. Then he stood up and said something to the other soldiers. The corporal still looked like he wanted to argue, but one of the older soldiers was already moving forward, and together they grabbed Klaus under the arms and started dragging him across the square. The pain was blinding. Klaus felt consciousness slipping again, the morphine mixing with shock and blood loss into a gray fog that made everything distant and unreal. He was being carried, he registered distantly. American soldiers were carrying a wounded German through active combat. It made no sense. Nothing made sense anymore. They brought him into a church. Klaus saw the stone walls and stained glass windows and wooden pews through the fog of pain and drugs, and his first incoherent thought was that they were bringing him here to execute him somewhere sacred, like it mattered where you died. But then he saw the other wounded, American paratroopers lying in rows on the floor and across the pews, some of them unconscious, others moaning or crying out. Blood everywhere, soaking into the old wooden floorboards and pooling in the gaps between stones. The smell hit him next, copper and shit, and the sweet rot smell of gangrene that Klaus had learned to recognize in Russia. This wasn't an execution site. This was a field hospital. They laid Klaus down next to an American private who was missing his right arm below the elbow. The private turned his head and looked at Klaus with glazed, shock-dilated eyes. For a moment, they just stared at each other, enemy and enemy, bleeding out on the floor of a French church while the battle raged outside. Then the American said something that might have been a curse or a prayer and turned away. Another medic appeared, this one with sergeant stripes and the same Red Cross armband. He looked at Klaus's leg, looked at the tag the first medic had tied on, and then started working without a word. No hesitation, no anger, just the same clinical efficiency, like Klaus was any other casualty that needed treatment. The sergeant medic cut away what remained of Klaus's trouser leg and examined the wound properly. Klaus saw him grimace at whatever he found there, but his hand stayed steady as he cleaned the injury with water from a canteen and applied fresh bandages over the sulfur powder. The door of the church burst open and 2 more Americans came in carrying a German corporal between them. Klaus recognized him dimly through the morphine haze. Friedrich from 3rd Company, a baker from Munich who made jokes about how the Führer's mustache looked like a cockroach. Friedrich was screaming, his hands pressed against his stomach where his intestines were trying to push through a ragged hole in his uniform. The Americans laid him down 3 meters from Klaus, and one of the medics, the younger one who'd first found Klaus, immediately started working on him. No questions about nationality or uniform, just more sulfur powder and bandages and morphine syrettes being jabbed into flesh. Klaus watched in stunned disbelief as the American medic tried to push Friedrich's intestines back inside his abdominal cavity, while Friedrich shrieked and thrashed. It was brutal, desperate work, the kind of field surgery that had maybe a 10% survival rate, the kind of work you did for your own men when you were out of options, not for enemy prisoners, never for enemy prisoners. Sie sind verrückt, Klaus whispered to no one in particular. You're insane. He must have said it louder than he thought because Friedrich turned his head and looked at Klaus with eyes that were already starting to glaze. They're helping us, Friedrich managed between screams. The Americans are helping us. They'll execute us later, Klaus said, because that was the only explanation that made sense. After they run out of their own wounded to treat. This is just... But he couldn't finish the sentence because he didn't know what it was. Strategy, propaganda, some elaborate psychological torture. Friedrich screamed again as the medic pressed down on his abdomen, and Klaus turned away because watching was somehow worse than experiencing his own pain. The afternoon dragged into evening, and the church filled up with more casualties, Americans mostly, but 3 more Germans were brought in over the next 2 hours, a private with a sucking chest wound, a lieutenant with both legs shattered by the same kind of shell that had hit Klaus, an older man, maybe 40, with the hollowed-out eyes of someone who'd been fighting since Poland, his left hand gone at the wrist. The American medics treated them all, every single one. Klaus watched through his morphine haze as they moved between German and American, wounded without distinction, applying the same bandages, the same sulfur powder, the same morphine, the same desperate attempts to keep men alive who had no business still breathing. At one point, the younger medic, Klaus, heard someone call him right, ran out of bandages and started tearing strips from his own uniform to make more. The German lieutenant, the one with the shattered legs, regained consciousness around 1900 hours and immediately started shouting, "Nicht anfassen! Nicht anfassen! Don't touch me." He was thrashing weakly against the American medic, trying to stabilize his fractures, his face twisted with terror and pain. The medic, the sergeant one called Moore, said something in English that Klaus was starting to recognize as the tone of someone trying to calm a panicked animal. It didn't work. The lieutenant kept thrashing and shouting until Moore did something that made Klaus's entire worldview tilt on its axis. He sat down next to the German officer, put a hand on his shoulder, and started singing. Klaus recognized the melody immediately, even though Moore's pronunciation was atrocious. Lily Marleen, the song that every German soldier knew, that got played on every radio station, that men hummed in the trenches when they were trying not to think about dying. Moore didn't know all the words, but he knew enough, and his voice was gentle and steady and completely incongruous with the sound of artillery fire outside and the smell of blood inside. The lieutenant stopped thrashing. He stared at Moore with an expression that Klaus recognized because he was feeling it himself, the complete cognitive dissonance of an enemy soldier singing your songs while saving your life. Moore kept singing while he worked, and the lieutenant lay still and let him, tears running down his face and mixing with the mud and blood on his cheeks. Klaus felt something break inside his chest, some fundamental assumption about the world that he hadn't even known he was carrying. He had been taught that Americans were savages, that they'd torture German prisoners, that they fought without honor or discipline or humanity. But here in this church that smelled like copper and shit and death, these two American medics were destroying themselves, trying to save men who'd been trying to kill them 6 hours ago. They were using their own supplies on enemy soldiers. They were singing German songs to comfort German officers. They were treating Klaus and Friedrich and all the others like they mattered, like their lives had value, like the uniform didn't define whether you deserved to bleed out on a church floor or get a chance to survive. The night brought new horrors. A German private, barely 18, was carried in with his jaw blown off by rifle fire. Moore and Wright worked on him for 20 minutes, trying to stop the bleeding, but there was too much damage and not enough blood left in his body. Klaus watched him die 3 meters away, watched the light go out of his eyes while Moore held his hand and Wright kept applying pressure to wounds that were never going to close. When it was over, Moore stood up and walked to the back of the church and vomited into a bucket. Then he wiped his mouth, took 3 deep breaths, and came back to treat the next casualty. Around midnight, a German officer appeared at the church door. Hauptmann somebody. Klaus didn't catch the name through his morphine haze. The captain had a Luger in his hand and 3 soldiers behind him, and he was demanding to know why there were Americans in the church treating German wounded. Moore and Wright stood up slowly, hands visible, no weapons. The captain was shouting now, something about Geneva Convention violations and unauthorized medical treatment, and how dare they presume to touch German soldiers. Wright said something in English and pointed at the wounded. Moore walked towards the captain with his hand still raised and said in his terrible German, "Your men, We help your men. No guns in church. Geneva. The captain looked around at the wounded Germans lying among the wounded Americans, at the blood-soaked bandages and the makeshift splints and the morphine syrettes scattered across the floor. His face went through several expressions that Klaus couldn't read. Finally, he holstered his Luger and said something short and clipped to Wright. Wright nodded and said in German that was barely comprehensible, "No weapons. Leave weapons outside. We treat everyone. Everyone." The captain stared at him for a long moment, then unbuckled his belt and laid his Luger on the stone threshold of the church. His men did the same. Then they came inside and started helping move the wounded into more stable positions. German soldiers working alongside American medics in a church in Normandy, while artillery shells exploded outside and the battle for France raged on. Klaus slept fitfully that night, the morphine wearing off in stages that brought fresh waves of agony. Every time he woke up, he saw Wright or Moore working on someone new. They never seemed to sleep, never seemed to stop. At one point, Klaus woke to find Wright changing his bandages, his hands shaking with exhaustion, but still methodical, still gentle. Klaus tried to say "thank you" in English, but the words wouldn't come. Wright just nodded and moved on to the next casualty. By dawn on June 7th, Klaus had started to understand that he might actually survive. His leg was gone, would have to be amputated above the knee if he lived long enough to get to a proper surgical facility, but the bleeding had stopped and the infection hadn't set in yet, and he was still breathing. Friedrich, the baker from Munich, had died sometime around 0300 hours. Klaus hadn't seen it happen, had only woken up to find a blanket pulled over Friedrich's face and Moore sitting against the wall with his head in his hands. The lieutenant with the shattered legs was still alive, feverish and delirious, but alive. The man with the missing hand was conscious and talking, actually having what looked like a conversation with an American private who'd lost his foot and apparently spoke passable German from growing up in Wisconsin. The fighting outside had moved on. Klaus could hear it in the distance now, the artillery and small arms fire rolling east toward Carentan like a thunderstorm moving across the landscape. The church was in Allied hands, which meant Klaus was officially a prisoner of war. He waited for the fear to come, the certainty that now they'd stop wasting supplies on Germans and let them die, or worse. It didn't come. Wright and Moore kept working. They'd been working for almost 24 hours straight, with maybe an hour of sleep total between them, and they were still making their rounds, checking bandages, administering morphine, trying to keep 80 wounded men alive with supplies meant for maybe 20. At one point, a French woman appeared at the door with a basket of bread and a jug of water. She looked at the carnage inside the church, crossed herself, and started helping Moore give water to the men who could drink. She didn't ask who was German and who was American. She just gave everyone water. Klaus felt something inside him break again, break and reform into a shape he didn't recognize. He'd been a soldier for 4 years. He'd killed men in Poland and France and Russia. He'd believed in the cause, or at least he'd believed enough to keep fighting, enough to not think too hard about what he was fighting for. But lying on the floor of this church, saved by men he'd been shooting at yesterday, treated with more humanity than he'd shown to most of the enemies he'd killed, it made him question things he'd never questioned before. Late on June 7th, an American medical truck finally arrived to evacuate the wounded. The critical cases first, German and American mixed together on the same stretchers. Wright organized the triage with the efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times. Klaus was designated stable, which meant he'd wait for the second truck, maybe the third. He didn't complain. He was alive, which was more than he'd expected 36 hours ago. Before they carried him out, Klaus managed to catch Moore's attention. The medic looked like he was about to collapse, his uniform stiff with dried blood, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. Klaus didn't have words for what he wanted to say, didn't have a language that could bridge the gap between what he'd believed about Americans and what he'd experienced in this church. So he just said in German, "Danke," thank you. Moore looked at him for a moment, then said in that terrible broken German, "You also person, all persons, we help all." Then he moved on to the next casualty, because there was always another casualty, always someone else who needed help, and the work was never finished. Klaus was loaded onto the truck and driven away from Angoville-au-Plain, away from the blood-stained church and the 2 American medics who'd saved 80 men who had no business surviving. He'd spend the next 11 months in a POW camp in England, where the food would be adequate and the treatment would be correct, and no one would torture him or execute him like the propaganda had promised. He'd be repatriated in 1946, returned to Hamburg to find his mother's house bombed to rubble and his sister's name on a list of civilians killed in the firebombing of 1943. He'd spend the rest of his life trying to understand what he'd experienced in that church, trying to reconcile the enemy he had been taught to hate with the men who'd kept him alive when they had every reason to let him die. He'd never succeed completely, would never find words adequate to explain the cognitive dissonance of being saved by the people you'd been trying to kill. But he'd remember Moore's hands on his leg, steady despite the exhaustion. He'd remember Wright singing Lily Marlene to a dying German officer. He'd remember the French woman giving water to German soldiers without asking why. And he'd carry those memories like a counterweight against all the propaganda, all the hatred, all the lies he'd been told about who deserved mercy and who deserved to die. In that church in Normandy, 2 American medics had proven that humanity could exist even in the middle of hell, that the uniform didn't define whether you were worth saving, that sometimes the enemy was just another wounded human being who wanted to live. It was a lesson Klaus had never expected to learn, a truth that made everything else more complicated and more simple at the same time. And it started with a decision by 2 men to treat all wounded the same, regardless of the flag they fought under, because in the end, bleeding was bleeding and dying was dying, and mercy didn't require you to agree on politics or ideology or which side God was supposed to be on. June 8th, 1944, 06:30 hours. Klaus Weber woke in a British field hospital 12 kilometers behind Allied lines, with phantom pain screaming from a leg that was no longer attached to his body. The surgery had happened while he was unconscious, sometime during the truck ride from Angerville, or in the first hours after arrival at the medical tent. He didn't remember any of it, just the morphine fog and the jostling of the stretcher, and now this, a clean white bandage wrapped around the stump of his left leg, ending 6 inches below his knee. The British surgeon who came by during morning rounds was perfunctory, but not cruel. He spoke some German, enough to explain that they'd saved as much of the tibia as possible, that the wound was clean, that Klaus was lucky the American medics had applied the tourniquet correctly, or he would have bled out before reaching proper medical care. Lucky. Klaus turned the word over in his mind, while staring at the canvas ceiling of the hospital tent. He was alive in a British POW hospital with one leg, waiting to be shipped to some camp in England where he'd spend God knew how long until the war ended. His entire platoon was probably dead, his country was losing, and a British surgeon was telling him he was lucky. The ward held 40 men, maybe half of them German prisoners, the rest British and American casualties waiting for transport to more permanent facilities. Klaus was in a bed, an actual bed with sheets and a thin pillow, not a cot or a stretcher or a hole in the ground. The man in the next bed was a British corporal with his chest wrapped in bandages and a drainage tube running from his lung cavity into a bottle on the floor. They didn't speak to each other for the first 3 days, just lay in adjacent beds and breathed and tried not to think about the things they'd seen. On the 4th day, the corporal woke up screaming from a nightmare and couldn't stop. Klaus watched as 2 British nurses held him down while the doctor administered something that finally knocked him out again. When the corporal woke up 6 hours later, calmer but still shaking, Klaus said in his broken English, "Bad dreams also me." The corporal looked at him for a long moment, taking in the German uniform, folded at the foot of Klaus's bed, the POW tag clipped to his hospital gown. Then he said, "Jerry bastards killed my whole section at Sword Beach. 23 lads I'd known since training." Klaus nodded slowly. "Americans killed all my platoon. 42 men." They sat in silence. After that, not quite enemies, not quite anything else. Just 2 men who'd survived when they shouldn't have. The British food was better than what Klaus had eaten in the Wehrmacht for the last 6 months. Not by much, but enough to notice. Oatmeal in the morning, sometimes with a bit of powdered milk. Soup at midday with actual chunks of potato and sometimes carrot. Bread that was only slightly stale. The portions were small, rationed carefully, but they were consistent, and no one was stealing from each other's plates. Klaus had seen German soldiers kill each other over crusts of bread on the Eastern Front. Here, everyone got the same amount, and everyone ate in silence, and nobody died over food. On June 15th, a German officer was brought into the ward. Oberleutnant Hans Müller, 352nd Infantry Division, captured during the fighting near Carentan. He had both legs, but his right arm ended at the elbow in fresh bandages. Klaus watched the British medical staff treat him with the same professional courtesy they showed everyone else, and then watched Müller's face go through the same progression of emotions Klaus remembered from the church: confusion, suspicion, disbelief, and finally something like shame. That night, after lights out, Müller whispered across the darkness, "They're treating us like humans." Klaus didn't answer immediately. Then, "Yes. Why?" "I don't know." But that wasn't quite true anymore. Klaus was starting to understand something fundamental. The Americans and British could afford mercy because their system worked. On June 20th, 2 weeks after D-Day, Klaus was transferred to a more permanent POW facility in southern England. The journey took 8 hours in the back of a truck. Klaus and 19 other German prisoners guarded by 4 British soldiers who looked bored rather than hostile. They stopped twice for bathroom breaks and once for food, more bread and soup, handed out by a British lance corporal who made a joke Klaus didn't understand, but that made everyone laugh anyway. The POW camp was a converted manor house surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Not luxurious, but not the death camp Klaus had been half expecting, based on 4 years of propaganda. The barracks were wooden buildings with bunk beds and coal stoves. The latrines were crude but functional. The food was adequate, monotonous and bland, but sufficient to keep men alive and mostly healthy. The interrogator assigned to Klaus was a captain in his 40s who spoke flawless German with a Bavarian accent. He asked about Klaus's unit, his commanding officers, the disposition of German forces in Normandy. Klaus gave name, rank, and serial number as required by Geneva Convention, then sat in silence while the captain asked more specific questions that Klaus refused to answer. The captain didn't press too hard, didn't threaten or bluster. After 30 minutes, he closed his folder and said, "You were wounded at Angerville-au-Plain, treated by American medics in a church." Klaus nodded warily. Those 2 medics saved approximately 80 men over 3 days. 12 of them were German. The captain paused. "Do you know what your own medical corps was doing during that same period?" Klaus didn't answer. The captain leaned forward. "They were executing Soviet prisoners who were too wounded to walk. They were leaving German casualties behind during retreats because they lacked the vehicles to evacuate them." The captain pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table. It showed a mass grave, bodies stacked like cordwood, all in German uniform. "This is from last month, near Minsk. Soviet troops advancing found your own wounded, abandoned by their own forces, left to die because the Wehrmacht couldn't spare the trucks to move them." He pulled the photograph back. "You were saved by Americans who had every reason to let you die. You were given morphine, sulfur powder, bandages, surgery, transport, and now you're in a camp where you'll be fed and housed until the war ends. Do you understand how different that is from what your own side would have done?" Klaus stared at the table. His throat felt tight. Finally, he said, "Yes." The captain stood up. "Good, because when this war is over, you're going to go back to Germany, and you're going to have to decide what kind of man you want to be. Whether you want to remember the lies you were told, or the truth you experienced." Then he left, and Klaus sat alone in the interrogation room for another 10 minutes before a guard came to escort him back to the barracks. Camp life settled into a rhythm. Morning roll call at 0700, breakfast at 0730, work details from 0900 to 1600, mostly labor on nearby farms, digging drainage ditches, repairing roads, harvesting crops under minimal guard. The British had calculated correctly that very few prisoners would try to escape from an island with no way to get back to Germany, and comfortable enough conditions to make the risk seem pointless. Klaus was assigned to a road repair crew with 8 other Germans, supervised by a British corporal who spent most of his time reading paperback novels while the prisoners worked. On the second day, Klaus asked the corporal why he wasn't more vigilant. The corporal looked up from his book and said in terrible German, "Where you go, swim to France." He had a point. Klaus started reading again for the first time since before the war. The camp library had Thomas Mann, Hermann Hesse, even some Goethe, books that had been banned in Germany for years because the authors were insufficiently loyal to the Reich, or had the wrong ancestry, or had published criticism of the wrong people. Sitting in a British POW camp, Klaus could read literature that had been forbidden in his own country, and nobody cared. Nobody monitored what he was reading. Nobody came to confiscate books or interrogate him about subversive content. On July 4th, the Americans in a nearby POW camp organized a celebration for their Independence Day. The British Guards allowed it, even provided some extra rations for the occasion. Klaus and other prisoners could hear the music and laughter drifting across the fence line. Muller sat next to Klaus during evening assembly and said quietly, "They're celebrating their independence while guarding us, and they're happy." "Yes," Klaus said. "Did we ever celebrate like that? In the Wehrmacht?" Klaus thought about it. "No, we marched. We sang martial songs. We drank when we could get alcohol. But happy?" He shook his head. "No." Mila was quiet for a moment. Then, "I keep thinking about the church, those American medics. They weren't celebrating. They were exhausted, covered in blood, probably terrified. But they kept working." "Yes." "Why did they do that?" "Really?" Klaus had been thinking about this for a month now. "Because they could. Because their system works well enough that they can afford to treat enemies like humans. Because they're not desperate." "We're desperate," Muller said. It wasn't a question. "We've been desperate for years," Klaus replied. "We just didn't know it because they told us we were winning." The summer passed slowly. Klaus learned English from a South African prisoner who taught school before the war. The vocabulary came slowly, but Klaus was persistent. By August, he could read simple English texts, could understand most of what the guards were saying, could carry on basic conversations. The prosthetic leg arrived in September, a crude wooden peg with leather straps that rubbed his stump raw for the first 2 weeks until he built up calluses. Learning to walk again was humiliating and painful. Klaus fell constantly, had to relearn balance, had to accept help from other prisoners, and even occasionally from British guards who seemed genuinely concerned about whether he'd adjust. A British physiotherapist visited the camp once a week to work with amputees. She was a stern woman in her 50s named Margaret, who had no patience for self-pity and infinite patience for actual effort. She pushed Klaus harder than any Wehrmacht officer ever had, made him walk laps around the camp yard until his stump bled through the bandages, made him practice stairs until he could climb them without using his hands. "You'll live," she told him after a particularly brutal session. "You'll walk. You'll work. You might even dance again if you practice enough. The Americans saved your life. Don't waste it feeling sorry for yourself." Klaus wanted to hate her, but couldn't. She was right. October brought news of Allied advances. The guards didn't hide the information. There were maps in the common room showing the front lines, newspapers available for prisoners who could read English. Klaus watched the red arrows push into Germany, watched the Reich shrink week by week, and felt nothing. No patriotic fervor, no desperate hope for German victory. Just a kind of numb acceptance that everything he'd fought for was collapsing, and he couldn't muster the energy to care. Muller was having nightmares. Klaus could hear him from the adjacent bunk, screaming in his sleep about things that neither of them discussed during daylight hours. One night, Klaus woke him up, and they sat outside in the cold October air, smoking cigarettes purchased with camp scrip they'd earned from work details. "What are we going to do?" Muller asked. "When it's over?" "Go home," Klaus said, "if there's anything to go home to." "And then what?" Muller's voice was tight. "Those American medics saved us. The British feed us. And we were the enemy." Klaus had been wrestling with the same questions for 4 months. Finally, he said, "The captain who interrogated me said I'd have to decide what kind of man I wanted to be after the war. What did you decide?" "I think I need to be the kind of man who deserves what those medics did for me." "How do you do that?" "I don't know yet." In November, Red Cross representatives visited the camp to verify conditions and process letters. Klaus was allowed to write home for the first time since capture. He addressed his letter to his mother at the old Hamburg address, knowing it probably didn't exist anymore. He wrote carefully, "I'm alive. I'm being treated well. I lost my leg, but I can walk again. The Allies are not what we were told. I will come home when I can. Please, be safe." In December, news came of the Ardennes offensive, Germany's last desperate push. The guards became more vigilant for a few days, but most of the German prisoners just listened to the news and recognized it for what it was: the death throes of a regime that had promised them victory and delivered only disaster. The offensive failed by Christmas. On January 15th, 1945, a new group of German prisoners arrived. Younger men captured during the Ardennes fighting, many of them injured. They came in scared and defiant, expecting torture, expecting starvation, expecting all the things the propaganda had promised. One of the new arrivals was a kid named Hans, maybe 17, with a bandaged shoulder and eyes that had seen too much too fast. The first night, Hans asked quietly, "Is it true they give us the same food as British soldiers?" "Close enough," Klaus said. "And they don't beat us?" "No." Hans was quiet. Then, "We were told they'd torture us, that it was better to fight to the death than be captured." Klaus thought about the church at Angerville. "They lied to us about a lot of things," he said finally. Hans looked at him with something like betrayal in his eyes. "You sound like a traitor." Klaus could have been angry. A year ago, he would have been. Now he just felt tired. "I sound like someone who's been a prisoner for 7 months and noticed that the enemy treats me better than my own officers did." February brought more news of Allied advances. The maps in the common room showed the Reich reduced to a shrinking pocket of territory. The British started offering classes, English lessons, vocational training, basic education. Klaus signed up for carpentry, figuring he'd need a trade when he returned to whatever remained of Germany. Learning to work wood with one leg was challenging but satisfying. You started with raw lumber and ended with something useful. Nobody died. Nothing exploded. You just created instead of destroying. In March, Muller received a letter from his wife, the first communication from home in 11 months. "Hamburg is gone. Firebombed to rubble," Muller said, his one hand shaking. "My wife and daughters are in a refugee camp in Bavaria. She says they're starving. The Wehrmacht is taking everything for the Eastern Front." Klaus thought about the bread and soup they had eaten that morning. "Write back," he said. "Tell her to surrender to the Americans when they arrive. Tell her the Allies will feed her." April brought the end. Hitler's suicide on April 30th was announced by the British Guards with professional solemnity. The war in Europe ended officially on May 8th, 1945. The camp didn't celebrate exactly, but there was a palpable shift in atmosphere. Guards became more relaxed. Prisoners started talking openly about repatriation, about going home, about what they'd find when they got there. Klaus was repatriated in August 1945, along with 200 other prisoners. They were loaded onto trucks, driven to Portsmouth, put on a transport ship to Hamburg. The voyage took 2 days. Klaus stood on deck and watched England disappear behind him. Hamburg was worse than he'd imagined. The city center was simply gone, turned into acres of rubble by incendiary bombs. Klaus's family home was a crater with fragments of brick walls sticking up like broken teeth. He searched for 3 days through refugee lists, before finding his mother's name on a register at a displaced persons camp 20 kilometers outside the city. She was alive, thin, gray-haired at 53, aged a decade in 5 years. When she saw Klaus walking toward her on his wooden leg, she didn't recognize him at first. Then she screamed and ran to him, and they held each other in the dusty yard of the camp while other refugees stared. That night, in a barracks that made the British POW camp look luxurious, Klaus told her everything about Angerville and the American medics, about the British camp and the adequate food and the carpentry classes, about being treated like a human being by the people he'd been told were savages. His mother listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Your sister Greta died in the firebombing of 43. Your father died in France in 40. Your uncle Karl was killed at Stalingrad. Your cousin Friedrich disappeared in the east, probably dead. Half our family is gone." She paused. "And you're telling me the Americans who did this also saved your life?" "Yes," Klaus said. "I don't know how to think about that." "Neither do I," his mother admitted. "But you're alive. That's enough for now." Klaus found work in Hamburg rebuilding the city. His carpentry skills from the POW camp made him valuable, and the wooden leg didn't matter when he was doing finish work or making window frames. The pay was minimal, but it was work, and it was purpose, and it wasn't killing anyone. In 1947, Klaus married a widow named Anna, who'd lost her first husband at Kursk. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter, and Klaus made sure they learned English from an early age. When they asked why, he told them the story of Angerville au Plain, about 2 American medics who treated 80 wounded men without asking which side they fought for. In 1952, Klaus received a letter forwarded through multiple Red Cross offices. It was from Robert Wright, the American medic from Angerville. Wright had tracked him down through military records and wanted to know if Klaus was alive, if he'd recovered. Klaus wrote back immediately. He thanked Wright for saving his life. He told him about Hamburg, about rebuilding, about his family. Wright wrote back 3 months later. He told Klaus about his work with the Methodist Church, building houses for poor families. He said he still had nightmares about the church, about the men he couldn't save. He asked if Klaus would be willing to correspond regularly. They wrote to each other for the next 30 years, 2 men who'd been enemies for 3 days in 1944 and something else for the rest of their lives. Wright died in 2013 at the age of 89. Klaus, then 91, was too frail to travel to America for the funeral, but he wrote a letter that Wright's son read at the service. "Your father saved my life when he had every reason to let me die. He treated me with mercy when I deserved none. I am 91 years old now. I have lived 69 years beyond that church in Normandy. I have raised children who raised children. I have built houses and repaired buildings and contributed something to the world instead of just destroying it. Every single day of those 69 years exists because Robert Wright decided that a wounded German soldier was worth saving. I cannot repay that debt. I can only honor it by trying to be worthy of the mercy I was given." Klaus Weber died in 2015, 2 years after Wright, at the age of 93. His funeral was attended by his children, his grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren, 23 people whose existence traced directly back to a decision made by 2 American medics in a French church on June 6, 1944. The church at Angerville au Plain still stands. The bloodstains are still visible on the floor and pews, preserved as a memorial to what happened there in June 1944. There's a plaque outside that lists the names of the medics and the number of men they saved. 80 lives, no distinction between American and German. Klaus Weber's name is not on that plaque. His story is just one among millions, but his story matters because it illustrates something fundamental. The Americans and British could afford mercy because their system worked. Their supply lines functioned. Their medical corps had enough morphine and bandages and sulfur powder to treat everyone, not just their own. That efficiency, that abundance, that ability to extend humanity even to enemies, that was the real difference between the sides. Germany lost the war not just because they were outgunned, but because they built a system that required cruelty, that treated human beings as expendable. The Allies won because they built a system that could afford to value human life, that could extend mercy without weakness. Klaus Weber learned that lesson in a church in Normandy. He carried it for 71 years, passed it to his children and grandchildren, tried to live in a way that honored the mercy he'd been given. It wasn't redemption. Klaus had done things in Poland and Russia that he never fully confessed. The Americans saving him didn't erase that, but it gave him a chance to rebuild, a chance to be something other than a soldier in a collapsing empire, a chance to learn that the enemy had been more human than his own leaders. Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore gave that gift to 12 German soldiers in Angoville-au-Plain, along with 68 American wounded. The gift of being treated like human beings, regardless of the uniform they wore. In the end, that's what war comes down to. Not the grand strategy or the political ideology, but individual moments where individual people make choices about how to treat other human beings. Wright and Moore chose mercy. That choice saved 80 men, and through those men, it gave proof that even in war's darkest moments, humanity could survive. The blood-stained pews in that Norman church are a memorial to that truth. So is Klaus Weber's life, lived in the shadow of those 3 days, built on the foundation of mercy given when he deserved none. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's a good sign. It means you were listening. Stories like this don't ask for applause, they ask for reflection. If you want more stories that don't simplify history, subscribe. If you think mercy matters even in war, leave a comment. And if this story stayed with you, a like helps others find it.